Welcome to Our Montana. I'm Mike Penfold. The last time we had a program talking about the Fetterman Fight out of Fort Phil Kearney in Wyoming along the Bozeman Trail. This program is going to focus on how 80 trained soldiers got themselves trapped and wiped out in 1866. My guests are Joe Marshall, who has studied this battle intensely. Joe is a full-blooded Lakota Indian who grew up on the Rosebud Reservation. And the other chap is Sterling Finn, who is a veterinary. He's passed now, but his passion when he was alive was studying Western history, and particularly the historical events around the Bozeman Trail and Fort Phil Kearney over by Sheridan, Wyoming. This video of Marshall and Finn was made with a handheld camera about 1998. War Chief Red Cloud and several bands of Sioux, along with their allies, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, took on a mighty campaign against the forts along the Bozeman Trail. The Army sorely misunderstood the fighting capacity of these Indian people and their desire to keep their homelands free of settlements.
The principal activity outside of Fort Phil Kearney in December, really all of the whole time that the fort existed, but in December in particular, was the wood train road traveling back and forth from the fort approximately 5 miles northwest of the pineries. And being late in the season, as it turned out, they were literally on their last run for fuel wood on December 21st. But the wood road was a great place for the decoy attacks to occur, and each time that happened, the sentry on Pilot Hill would see the attack up on Sullivan Ridge, signal the post, a relief column under Fetterman or someone would be sent out. So there are really a couple of prior events that led up to this one, and then we'll go into this battle in direct. On December 6th, the Indians attacked the wood train. We don't know if it was the same group of decoys, but presumably it was. How well rehearsed their tactics were at that time, we don't know. But what we do know is that when the train was attacked on December 6th, that Colonel Carrington ordered Captain Fetterman out with a small contingent of cavalry to go to the relief of the train and crowd the Indians across Lodge Trail Ridge. He himself, Colonel Carrington, would take a mounted column of infantry and go around Sullivan Hills and catch the retreating Indians between the two and destroy them. It turns out that Fetterman went for the decoy trap, came down off of Sullivan Ridge and was led across Lodge Trail Ridge and down into this very broken ground over here, and was surrounded by warriors and almost annihilated. A young lieutenant and much of the cavalry defected, as we called it in Vietnam, bugging out, whatever, but basically Captain Fetterman and a very few men left were surrounded, and only by the very late appearance of Colonel Carrington and the mounted infantry was he prevented from being destroyed on December 6th. Fetterman was badly shaken, said so in effect in his after-action report, and one would think that he might have learned a valuable lesson, but he didn't. 2 weeks later, approximately on December 19th, the same thing occurred. The decoys again attacked the train. My personal feeling is that they had probably tuned up their act in the meantime and had the plan that ultimately worked here on December 21st in place on the 19th. But on the 19th, Colonel Carrington dispatched Captain Powell, who was in command at the wagon box the following August, who was a very disciplined officer, and he was dispatched to relieve the train and not pursue the Indians and report back to the post, which he did. So the trap, in effect, was not sprung. 2 days later, on December 21st, the Indians again attacked the wood train. Powell was again ordered out, but Fetterman stepped forward and, by virtue of his higher brevet rank, requested to take the relief party. Carrington gave him that authority, but specifically cautioned him not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge or to pursue the Indians beyond Lodge Trail Ridge, to simply relieve the train and to heed the lessons of December 6th. All we know is that he, at some point in time, we do know that he was lured or drawn. He did not go up on the wood road directly, but came around behind Sullivan Ridge in an attempt to single-handedly take on those Indians coming off of the ridge without the benefit of two separate columns, as was done on December 6th. The Indian decoys, of course, were really watching him every step of the way, saw the action of the different approach, and led him up on top here of Lodge Trail Ridge, which he'd been ordered not to cross. Up just about over the back of this camper truck, that high dome hill, and the little saddle just this side of it was at least one of the points that Captain Fetterman and the 81 men crossed. They operated in a small skirmish activity up on top of this ridge, and at some point the decoys, and particularly there are Indian accounts of Crazy Horse riding back up the hill, taunting, gesturing, maybe even getting off his horse. Joe has mentioned other times and can talk about a little bit, taunting those soldiers to come off the ridge and fight. And there's only 10. At some point, Fetterman lost it. He exceeded his orders, came off of the ridge, was drawn out onto this ridge, almost a mile and a half down to the end. When all of the soldiers were well within the Indian lines, the trap was sprung and the soldiers were annihilated. That is essentially the story that we're going to do on the field today, and this is why we refer to it as a decoy battle. It may have been the Northern Cheyenne that suggested the decoy tactic. Certainly the Lakota people had used it, but the Cheyenne had been very effective down on the Platte River in 1865 at Julesburg and Plattebridge Station in drawing troops out of the fort into the ground where they had pre-positioned warriors. So it was very, very likely that was suggested and set up by the Northern Cheyennes, who has, as I said, practiced that very well. A decoy group of, we think, approximately 10 warriors was chosen, probably led by a 26-year-old Oglala Lakota named Crazy Horse. There were representatives from the three tribes of the Lakota, the Minneconjou, the Oglala, and the Unkpapa. There were also some Northern Cheyenne and a couple of Arapaho.
I think one of the things that infuriated Fetterman certainly was the fact that after the decoys made contact with his column on the back of Sullivan Hills, the decoys rode right up to the column, sometimes within yards. Crazy Horse reportedly, and a couple others, stood on the rump of their horse in plain sight and challenged anybody to shoot them, and made all kinds of interesting gestures as well. And during this whole chase, not a single one of the decoys was hit. Not a single one. There might have been a couple of flesh wounds, but not a horse went down, not a man went down. And if you stop to consider that, that's very frustrating, to say the least, for a column of people armed with and that has to definitely figure into the fact that those decoys were able to lead them off the ridge. At one point, somewhere on the other side of Lodge Trail Ridge, Crazy Horse even stopped to build a fire and warm himself in plain sight of the soldiers. A couple of times he got off his horse, lifted his horse's hooves up, and cleaned the ice off his horse. And so did a couple of the other decoys. And all of this was intended to infuriate the soldiers so that they would lose control of themselves and be drawn into the trap. And there are a lot of interesting stories like that, and as we all know, it worked.
Was there snow on the ground here at the time?
There was snow on the ground. The ridge was basically frozen. There was not a lot of snow, maybe a couple of inches, and some drifts. The ground was very cold and definitely frozen.
There's a question back there.
Had Crazy Horse really good reputation?
By then, he was 26 years old, and at the age of 21 and 22, it said he earned more battle honors than most grown men did in their lifetimes. So his reputation was well established, which was the reason he was asked to be the leader of the decoys.
You can't get a reputation of counting coup then?
Bravery
I mean,
in
it
battle.
wasn't the killing, it was.
No, it was counting coup, demonstrating courage in battle.
He was 26. What was the age of Fetterman?
Fetterman was in his mid-30s, 36, I think.
How old is Red Cloud these days?
Oh, in his late 40s. He was born in 1821.
Well, Joe and I will each go into the weapons. We'll have a little mid walk break with some refreshments and lemonade, I think. As we go out on the ridge, it's going to be imperative that you realize that we're going to kind of have to do the battle in a backward order. The scenario is that they came off of the ridge and were led astray, if you will, out to the far end of the ridge, paying little, if any, attention to the terrain, as is that little saddle we just crossed between us and the depression, if you will, or a saddle between us and the monument was the area of a large number of remains, and the warriors used every piece of ground cover, including those rocks, to approach that relatively narrow portion of the ridge. As you can see, that's very narrow there, and the warriors were on both sides of the ridge, and they were working back. Little geography that you really need to understand. That, again, is Lodge Trail Ridge. So after Fetterman's soldiers came down off of that ridge, he came along, literally the track we're on, the Bozeman Trail is right here, this depression that runs along this ridge. And as I said at the monument, at this point, the soldiers are being drawn out by the decoys. There's no fighting yet, but there is some long-range pot-shotting at the decoy warriors who are out here in front, continuing their gesturing and taunting to bring the soldiers along. The disposition of the main Indian forces was almost another mile yet out this ridge, on both sides of the ridge, and at the far end, at the creek, in the valley down there where you can see the road goes out of sight behind the hill. So this is the outbound thing that we're doing, but we're not going to come back. So it's necessary to do the outbound and then in our minds do the retrograde fight backwards. So after the attack was sprung out at the end, there are about 4 positions where the troops fought their way back, major positions, and this was the next to the last. On this hill, in a final desperate attempt, this is evidenced by not only the Indian accounts, by the archaeological evidence that we have. The cavalry that was predominantly destroyed out on that little knoll just beyond the tree, that little high knoll to the left, to the right of the tree, is where the bulk of the cavalry was destroyed, and Lieutenant Drummond was killed. At that point, the command, of course, fell apart. They had no officer, and at that point it was really every man for himself. For a while we know that the cavalry fought independently, that is on their own. As they fought their way back, trying to get back to the fort, they reached this point, and the cavalry soldiers deployed along this ridge, as evidenced by a string of cavalry-type cartridges along this ridgetop where we're standing, apparently giving the mounted infantry and any foot infantry that was with them at the time an opportunity to go ahead and take a next position, which turned out to be that hill. The men that did not die here ultimately joined the survivors, if you will, and the infantry on that little hill where the monument is today, and were finally surrounded and destroyed. So that's the end position. If you look back to the little Dome Hill and Lodge Trail Ridge, Fetterman came off of the ridge just about straight over the monument, a little bit to the right of where the sight line above the monument. If you come to the right a little bit, those 2 brush patches, then there's a little high dome just to the right on the skyline, to the right side of the rightmost brush patch. That's the point where he came down. From there on, appreciate that he was completely out of any type of visual control from the post. You can barely hear shots fired from here at the post, and there was no way for any relief or support. At that point, he was committed and he was on his own. And we have a long way to go, and you'll appreciate when we get out further just how far he was drawn away from the fort and decoyed. Questions? Yes.
Were any Native Americans killed in the battle?
There were. Unfortunately, there are not very good records, or any records. The oral history book can give us a great deal more on that. But the count was relatively low. But we really don't have a good accounting for just how many. But quite few, because as Joe will talk about more perhaps a little later, the Indian way was not to take losses. These men fought until the tables turned or their advantage was not good. They mounted their horses, took a different position, a different approach, attacked from a different angle. They were guerrilla fighters, so they were good field cavalry. They didn't stand and shoot each other.
Okay, I'm sitting right on the Bozeman Trail, the old Bozeman Trail. See the monument in the center of the picture. And apparently, that's where Fetterman and Company came over the top of the ridge. And then followed this ridge right down to where we're this side. You can see a little saddle there. Apparently they fought their way back through that saddle. The survivors up to where the monument is.
Held its position, and where Drummond was killed, and is so marked, that position is so marked in Drummond's body on
Drummond Hill.
Colonel Carrington's after battle actual report map. Once the cavalry soldiers left that position, it was a very disorganized fight. The mounted infantry and those few that reached this distance from the infantry, and yes, the infantry was out here, evidenced by heavy amounts of musket percussion caps and 58 caliber mini bullets, which were the type used by the infantry, intermixed with the cavalry weapons, which were Spencer cartridges, which will go into weapons a little bit. This is the point where the ridge is the narrowest. There's a lot that can be, can you all hear in the back? If not, gather in us, okay. There's a great deal to be learned by the interpretation of the artifact fields. This is one of my favorite because while not necessarily simultaneously, but probably, while these 2 or 3 cavalrymen were posted right up over here and giving covering fire to the soldiers escaping through that gauntlet, if you like, that low, narrow portion, there was also a substantial line of cavalry right here, right along here. It ran about 20, 25 feet along here in a nice linear line. It would appear that they were giving substantial covering fire to their own troops for what I hope is an obvious reason. So we're going to ask the group to interpret it, what that might mean if you were to find an artifact field of cavalry cartridges in a nice long line here. If the line goes on this axis, they had to be firing either that way or that way. If you'll look over there, you'll see that slip lip, that slip out indentation just beyond the edge of the brush there is real close to this escape route. And Joe has assured me that is an easy bow shot from right there. And I can assure you that the bullets were impacting right at the lip, and it would be no problem for a warrior to pop up, take a quick shot, and be out of sight before he was ever seen. So this is a real nice way to visualize what the artifact evidence talks to us about, and talks to us about the use of the terrain by the warriors to their major advantage while these soldiers are here in this really exposed position. Interestingly enough, there's very little, if anything, up on this high ridge except these occasional little piles of shells from a covering man or two. But this was a major position, and you can appreciate that.
Does that indicate that there were no attacks from this direction?
It's very steep down the back side of that. It's very exposed.
Yeah, right. And more cover. More cover.
So this is the obvious approach. Also, there are Indians down on the back side, on the far down in the valley, and these fellows may have been attempting to push them back up this hill and down the backside right into their waiting warriors on the far side.
Another part of the decoy.
Sure, sure. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, this was a flow. This was a flowing battle. It was not not a fixed location. And these warriors were constantly adjusting their position, mounting their ponies, moving around, and taking advantage of the terrain.
So there was no preset plan?
No, I'm saying, well, once the trap was sprung, the Indians
no, it's-
used the terrain. I'm just saying that as the battle progressed and as the soldiers reacted, the warriors reacted in kind and used their tactics and their ponies to adjust their position and to take advantage of these geographical features. Off the end of this ridge, down through a field, and down into the valley of Pino Creek, right within 200, 250 feet of Pino Creek is how far the cavalry got. We don't have any way to know where Fetterman himself was. The Lieutenant Grummond, who was in charge of the cavalry, was clearly way out in advance, and he was probably leading the cavalry in a fast chase at that point of the warriors. But I just want you to appreciate, again, this fight has not really started, and it hasn't started for quite some time yet, and you can see how far across Lodge Trail Ridge we are, how far we are from the fort, how difficult it would be to hear any firing, and an impossible way to get any support out here. And again, the fight hasn't started. I want to tell a little story and share with you that was told me by Bill Tallbull, Northern Cheyenne. Bill and I did the tours for a couple years before Joe and I got together. And we came out here one time alone, and Bill was in a particularly reflective mood, and he was a formal or kind of an informal tribal historian for the Northern Cheyenne, and he had 3 relatives who were in this fight. And I knew something that had happened down off this little hill down here in the sagebrush, just a short distance, based on some archaeological evidence that we found. And so I asked Bill that morning if there was any. He was telling me little stories that he'd been told by his grandparents when he was a boy. And he was in a very reflective state and was telling these little vignettes and stories as we were going along the trail. When we came to this point, I asked Bill if there was anything down in this draw that happened that was of any great significance, without telling him anything more than that. And he proceeded to tell me a story that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. But first of all, I want to position the troops because it's relative to that story. As we've pointed out, the cavalry was on that little high knoll, and their horses were being held off by horse holders in a little area just the other side of that hill, and the deployment of those cavalrymen were down the face of these slopes that you see coming down the hill, not as far as the brush line, about halfway down from the top of this hill to the brush line. There were also infantrymen with their long-range rifles on that hill, not as many of them, but there was a great deal of firing down into this little draw by the carbines, by the Spencer carbine, and a little bit of firing by the rifles, but not as much, and I'll show you why in just a minute. So we got to this point, and Bill Tallbull told the story about Little Wolf, who was one of the Northern Cheyenne decoys who was here in this fight. His brother, who was known as Big Nose or Roman Nose, not the Cheyenne Roman Nose, but another Big Nose or Roman Nose, was apparently mortally wounded down somewhere in the lower approaches, probably by the carbine fire from over here. When he was wounded, he asked several of the warriors with him to bring him up to a higher spot on the ridge here where he could better view the battle, knowing that he was dying. Right down here, Bill pointed to within 30 feet of the spot where we found a concentration, a heavy concentration of incoming Army rifle fire in a little circle about 15 feet in diameter. In my opinion, those warriors who were with Little Wolf's brother, Big Nose, were fired at a volley from over here and impacted there. And it just gave me chills then, and I got them now. Joe, you want to talk about warrior weapons at this point?
Sure. Very quickly, this firearm is representative of the kind of a rifle that would have been carried by the warriors who were fortunate enough to have firearms. This is this a trade rifle? This is a trade rifle.
Originally a flint.
Originally a flintlock, converted to percussion. It's a 54 caliber muzzle loader, single shot, obviously. Some of the warriors carried these, and it's just heavy, and some of them they sawed off the front sight, even sawed off the barrel to make it easier to carry from the back of a horse. But at the same time, many of the warriors didn't have that many rounds to go with it. There are stories that Crazy Horse in this battle did have a muzzle loader, but he only had 4 rounds. So he did most of his fighting close in and with the bow. So that tells you the kind of weaponry that was available during this fight. There were more arrows expended by the Indians than obviously firepower. Sterling and I were talking one time, and we did a low-end estimate of the possible number of arrows that were fired during this battle. Given that there were around 700 warriors, and each of those warriors carried 30 to 40 war arrows, and if even 90% of those were expended, we're talking about at least 20,000 arrows that were expended in 45 minutes of this battle.
Nowhere, I think, in this entire area is there a more dramatic and tragic example of the clash of the people that were here at the time than here on this ridge that we're on. This is the Bozeman Trail that we're literally standing on. This fight is really only one of a very small handful of battles in U.S. military history where the entire group was wiped out. You think of the Alamo in 1836, the Grattan fight, which was a small matter, but it was total, in 1854, this fight in 1866. I want you all to really appreciate that this was not a massacre. I think we should think of a massacre more in the sense of innocent, unarmed, and unprotected people, civilians in particular. I think the Oklahoma bombing was a massacre, for example. This was not. This was a well-armed force of soldiers who had plenty of weapons and plenty of ammunition, and they simply lost the fight.